Hello, this is Tom Repass of Canyon Rim Honeybees in western South Dakota. Welcome to our series Introduction to Beekeeping, presentations dedicated to helping new beekeepers succeed during their first few years of keeping bees. This presentation goes from introducing your new colony through spring and summer of your first year. Once you acquire your bees, it's helpful to keep these goals in mind as you go through your first season from spring to summer and then approach fall. You need to make sure that your hive has everything that the bees need, that it's in a good location out of the wind, near food and water, that the bees have enough space to raise brood and store honey to last them through the winter, and that as they draw the foundation out into comb, the comb is of good quality so it can serve them for many years to come. You need to make sure that your bees are well fed throughout the season. Established colonies often do not require feeding, aside from perhaps during a drought or a dearth, or perhaps to uh, prepare them to have enough to survive through the winter. But a new colony has a lot of work ahead of it. It has to draw out new comb. It has to grow and expand, ideally into 2 deep boxes at the minimum to survive our northern winters. So this takes a lot of energy and calories to produce all that wax, which is why you may need to feed your bees throughout most of the season, or at least until they develop enough bees so that they can forage on their own. You need to make sure that your queen is healthy and laying lots of eggs. Now, ideally, the queen that is in your nuke or it comes with your package should be young, and so she should ideally last until her second year at least before you need to replace her. But sometimes things happen and queens can fail, even young queens, so you need to pay attention, and if something is happening with the queen, be ready to take action, whether that is getting the colony a new queen, requeening, or perhaps giving them a comb of brood from another colony so they can raise a new queen on their own. And then finally, you need to make sure that your bees are healthy and without any diseases or parasites such as varroa mites. I've gone through some of these slides in a previous presentation, but it's good to review them, what you need to worry about and look for in the few weeks after you introduce your package bees or your nuke into the new hive. So what you should expect, if you bought a package, the queen should be released from the queen cage in packages. They should be consuming sugar syrup and begin drawing out new comb, and the queens should begin laying eggs. You have to be careful because if the queen died or is rejected, if especially package bees decide they want to fly away or drift into another colony, that can be a problem. If you don't feed them, they can starve. I've heard of stories of new beekeepers not knowing that they needed to feed their new package of bees syrup, and they just put them in the hive and assumed all would be good, and the bees just starved to death, which is very sad, and it obviously should never happen. Uh, Sometimes there can be robbing. A stronger established colony can try to attack and rob a newer colony before they've established a large enough population to defend themselves. And then as the bees begin drawing out comb, they sometimes can draw it out poorly or not at all or in the wrong location. So if you have gotten a package, as I've talked about in previous presentation, you put the queen cage in between the combs so the bees can access that and slowly release her by eating through the candy. If you go back after a few days and she's not released yet, you can poke a small hole in the candy portion to allow the bees better access to her, or even remove the cork and let her walk out. But make sure you are pointing the cage down into the colony because queens can fly off. And if they fly off, there's a good chance they may never make it back to their colony. If this ever does happen, the best thing to do is leave the hive open, walk away for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then come back and just close the colony up. Because some queens, if they're light enough to fly, will circle around and go back to the nearest colony that is available, which hopefully is the one that you were putting them in, and not into another colony where, of course, they likely will be killed by the bees who already have a queen. Now, you don't want to leave the queen cage in there for too long because the bees will begin building comb around it or in the gaps nearby, and this can be a real mess, and it can upset the bees when you try to cut it out, or you can even kill bees. Or if the queen is on one of these combs and you're cutting it out or moving it around, you could accidentally kill the queen. So you don't want to leave those cages in there too long, just a few days until the queen is released, and then remove the cage and push the combs together. Well, you should be feeding your new colonies sugar syrup. They need a source of carbohydrates for energy so they can secrete wax and draw out new comb. And at first, you should feed them as much as they will take. Later on, you can cut back, especially if the colony is established and there's a honey flow. It is possible to overfeed bees. They could become honeybound and have no room for the queen to lay eggs. So you do need to feed them, but there may be a point that you can cut back or stop later in the summer. It takes a huge amount of energy for the bees to draw out wax. If you happen to have any old comb from colonies that had died the previous year, you can use that and give that to your package bees or new colonies, and it will definitely give them a head start. You might not need to feed them quite as much syrup because they don't have to draw out as much wax as when drawing out foundation. As soon as the queen is released, she should begin laying eggs within a few days, as soon as there's some foundation drawn. Package bees are at a disadvantage because the older bees begin aging and dying out, and thus the bees are under a timeline where they need to draw out comb for the queen to start laying eggs to raise more baby bees to replace the bees that are beginning to age and die of old age. So you should, within a few days, begin seeing something like this. This comb that has a yellow foundation it's harder for you to see the eggs, and that's why I tend to prefer the plastic foundation that is black, because the eggs are easier to see, especially if you have older eyes like mine and you need reading glasses to see tiny things. The bees don't care one bit. They're in the hive where it's pitch black, so the black foundation that you might use in your brood nest is mainly to help you to see the eggs and the young larvae better. Within a few days later, you should begin seeing larvae that have hatched. And so this is a site that you should see within a couple of weeks of introducing your packages into a new hive. The wax is being drawn out. There's some capped brood, and on the top there's a little bit of syrup that the bees are ripening and slowly capping. The whole comb is not completely drawn out, but they should fill it out as the population of bees increases over time. The one problem with new colonies is absconding or drifting. Absconding is when the entire colony flies away. That's unlikely in a nucleus colony because they already have brood and baby bees and they're not going to abandon them. But in package colonies that they have not accepted their new queen necessarily right away, or they're not really sure where their colony is supposed to be, and there's nothing to hold them there. They may just fly off or fly into a different colony, which we call drifting. So when you introduce packages, uh, multiple packages in the same time, it's good to in the evening so that they will stay where they have put, and also put some grass loosely into the entrance, which you can remove the next day. We see lots of photos online of hives in long rows, but that simply encourages the bees to drift before they figure out where uh, their hive is. Bees don't have a problem determining the difference between left and right, but they have trouble counting, the third one from the left or the fifth one in from the right. And so that's why you can put them side by side, or you can face the hives in different directions so they can orient to the differences in the bee yard and the surrounding area. So now your colony has been accepted and the new queen, and it is now established in its new hive. So what should you expect now? Well, the colony should begin expanding in population. Sometimes in package bees, there's a die-off a few weeks, so the population actually dwindles slightly. That's normal because the older bees are dying off. But there should be brood being raised, so the colony begins increasing. You will eventually need to add more room. The mite population will begin increasing also, so you'll need to keep in mind that you may need to do a mite treatment, especially towards the end of summer before they go into fall. And the bees should begin storing honey and pollen to serve them for the future winter to come. What can go wrong? There could be problems with the queen. Maybe she's not laying well, or maybe she fails. Maybe they did not store enough honey and they starved during the winter. Or the bees are weakened by mites. This is probably the number one reason for new beekeepers to lose colonies of bees, are not managing mites correctly. And I have an entire separate presentation dedicated to Varroa mites, how to monitor and manage and treat for them. So a common question is with new beekeepers is, when should you add more boxes? Uh, you don't want to add it too soon, because if you do, they may go straight up and they'll only be utilizing the central 3 or 4 frames, leaving the frames on the outside untouched. And so usually you wait until they're covering and have been working on and drawing out at least 8 frames of foundation. If you add it to, say, a box like this, that's much too early, and then they'll end up not utilizing all the frames on this outside. Sometimes they don't want to draw out all the frames of foundation, leaving the ones on the outside untouched. So a way that you can encourage them to begin drawing out the undrawn foundation is something called checkerboarding, basically alternating the foundation with some comb that's already been drawn out. So as a general rule, when you're thinking about adding boxes to your colony, you should give them more space before the honey flow, because they can use the honey flow and incoming nectar as an energy source to draw out wax. And then later in the summer, when there's not as much incoming nectar, then you should not add as much space, because the bees need some time to ripen and consolidate their honey, or if you're feeding them syrup, you don't want to have a bunch of empty frames going into winter and very little honey stored among all of them or scattered throughout the hive. So what are the problems? What can go wrong? Well, one of them can be they're not drawing out the comb very well. I find rubbing a bit of wax on some of the plastic foundation can sometimes help. Uh, Sometimes you can have comb drawn out like this. The bees seem to want to draw it in the wrong direction. It's important that you don't just leave this, because they'll end up making a poorly drawn comb on this foundation. If you leave it, it can actually develop into something like this. This is where someone did not push all the frames together. If you see something like this, unfortunately, the only solution is to cut the comb off. Now, there is brood on here, so it's possible that the queen could be on this comb or in the back. So when you do this, you need to be gentle, and you need to make sure that if the queen is on the comb, you allow her to walk back into the hive. Sometimes if you do something like this, you leave a frame out of a box for whatever reason. Maybe you took a feeder out and you're going to put a frame in there and you just simply forgot. They'll end up drawing a comb from the top of the hive, just as they would if they were in a hollow tree. Or even worse, if you put an empty box onto a hive and you forgot to put frames in it like this, they'll just simply fill it up with comb. And so this can be a real mess, of course, to deal with. Sometimes if I have something like this, rather than messing around with it, I might just put it at the very bottom of the colony, so that over the winter they'll be able to pull the honey out, move up, and then by the next spring this box may be completely empty, and you can just take it off the hive before the bees have moved back down into it. So how to prevent problems with drawing out comb? If they have undrawn foundation, you should be feeding the bees, especially if there's no nectar flow, to stimulate wax production, so they have the energy to secrete wax to draw out the comb. Don't give them more undrawn foundation than they can cover, so it's very important to not add more space. I've seen photos of a new beekeeper excited, and they put on the 2 deep boxes and they put on 3 honey supers, all undrawn foundation, all within a month after they had gotten their bees. And obviously that's what you do not want to do. You only want to give them enough space that they need for that time. So to start with, you're going to be using 1 deep box for your package bees and for your nuke, and then add the second deep box maybe several weeks later as they fill up and draw out the wax in the bottom box. Make sure that the combs are evenly spaced and you don't leave any openings or gaps. This is especially important if you're using undrawn foundation to start with. You want them to be all snug to each other. There can be a gap on the outside, but all the combs and foundation should be pushed together tightly so that they're all equally spaced. And then every time you perform a hive inspection, you should always look for poorly drawn comb. And this is true for a new colony or an established colony. This is something that I do, as a beekeeper. Whenever I'm going through, I scrape off any burr or brace comb that shouldn't be there before it becomes a larger problem. Getting your bees to draw out good quality comb without any deformities is very important. Those combs can serve your bees well for even several years before they need to be replaced. So another problem, you can't find your queen. A lot of newer beekeepers say, I can't find my queen. I've never seen my queen. Well, if you see these eggs, you don't really need to see your queen. You know she's there. And don't get me wrong, it's fun to see the queen. I love seeing the queen. But you shouldn't have to go through your hive to find her every single time that you're working the hive because you disturb the bees, for one, and as you're manipulating those frames, every time you do that, there's a chance that you could injure the queen accidentally, not wanting to, but accidentally. So if you open your hive and you see eggs and young larvae, all is good. You don't need to worry about finding the queen. Other issues is if there's a poor brood pattern. So you want the comb in your hive to look more like the photo on the left. Lots of capped worker brood, very few skipped spaces. And when you see a comb like the one on the right, there's some type of issue going on. Maybe the queen is failing. Maybe the bees are dealing with a brood disease, such as European foul brood or chalk brood. Or maybe the bees are overwhelmed by varroa mites, and this is what we call parasitic mite syndrome, where the mites are all through the brood and the brood is dying and being removed by the bees, especially if you have hygienic bees. So the pattern on the left is what you want to see, and the pattern on the right, if you see that there's some problem going on, it doesn't always mean a failing queen. It could mean disease or something else. But you definitely need to take a closer look to try to figure out what is causing that poor brood pattern. And then once you figure it out, you need to do something about it. Sometimes you can see something like this. This is a failing queen. So there are some capped worker brood on the side, but there's a lot of drone cells. And so this queen is defective. Either she ran out of sperm because she was an old queen, or she never mated properly. If you see this in a new colony, you need to replace that queen immediately. You need to find that queen and pinch her and introduce another queen. And I have a whole other presentation about queen issues and how to requeen colonies. So I'm not going to go into it quite as much detail in this presentation. And here's another photo of a failing or drone laying queen. So you're seeing lots of drones, poor brood pattern. And if you don't do anything about this quickly, this colony is doomed and it's going to not succeed. Well, sometimes we find queen cells in our colonies. And it's, the beekeepers often debate and argue, what is a supersedure cell? What is a swarm cell? What is an emergency cell? So if you see a bunch of cells on the face of the comb like this, and there's no eggs present, then what happened is the queen probably died. So maybe you inadvertently injured her or killed her when you were moving the combs around, or maybe she fell out of the hive when you were holding the frame up. Who knows? But if you see this, and then these are especially in a new colony that you just had gotten, you do not want to go through and kill all of these queen cells out, because if you do, they will have no replacement, and then that colony will end up eventually dying. Sometimes you can see cells like this, just a few queen cells here and there, and this tends to be more common in package bees because of the dynamics of the hive population. There was a gap in raising young bees while the queen was caged and while they were drawing out brood. And even though it wasn't a long gap, it might only be, say, a week or so, the bees might think there's a problem with the queen. Even though the queen is perfectly fine, they may be confused and think they need to replace her. So if you see queen cells but no eggs, you need to leave them alone because the queen may have died and the bees are in the process of replacing her. But if you do see queen cells like this, but there are eggs, then you may want to destroy them so they don't replace their queen. Again, especially in a brand new package colony, it's really not the queen's fault that the population dynamics are a little bit off and the bees are confused. Or you might decide maybe the bees know best and just let nature take its course and let them raise a new replacement. Now, if you go into your colony and you see this, you've gotten much worse problems. A bunch of eggs laid in all different angles all throughout the comb means that you have laying workers. So basically the queen was lost or she died, and because the queen pheromone was no longer present, this allowed workers to begin, their ovarioles begin developing to where they could lay eggs. Now, of course, worker bees do not mate and they're not fertile, so all of these eggs will be infertile eggs, which means they will develop into drones. I've seen photos, online, or even folks wanting to buy a queen from me, and then they showed me a photo like this, and it's like, this is too late. If you try to introduce a queen into a colony like this, more than likely the bees will reject her. And if you don't do anything about it, eventually all you will see are drones developing. And once it gets this advanced, these are old bees, and the colony basically is doomed and is going to die. If you do try to put a new queen into a colony of laying workers, they will kill her. This is a picture of bees balling a queen. The bees do not sting a queen that they do not want to death, but instead they ball her. They basically cluster around her and stress her and raise the heat inside this ball to the point where the queen eventually dies. So the answer to laying workers is to introduce them to another colony using the newspaper method. There's been many beekeepers over the past decades, if not centuries, trying to figure out a way to solve laying worker without having to introduce or unite with another hive. And most of these methods are, they're either time consuming or they're not very effective. So this is a reason why when you start out as a new beekeeper, it's always best to have more than one colony. Because if you have one colony and now they develop laying workers, that's it. That colony is doomed and there's nothing else you can do. But if you have 2 or 3 colonies, then you could unite the laying workers to another colony. And what you do is put a single sheet of newspaper over the colony, and then put the other colony box over top. And over time, they will eat through the newspaper, and as they do, they begin intermingling, and their scents become the same. And so the colony that has an established queen will take over, and that queen will be the queen for the colony that previously had laying workers. Something else that you must do your first summer, and for that matter, every year that you have bees, is you need to make sure that the bees have enough food to survive winter. And obviously, this is going to be different. For what I need to do up here in the North and South Dakota is going to be quite different than somebody who is only wintering their bees, say, down in Georgia or Florida. Your first year, if you're not sure, you probably should not harvest any honey at all. You'll have plenty of years to harvest honey down the road, as you go through your journey keeping bees. As fall approaches, the bees will do what they call backfilling the emerging brood with honey. So in the center part of this frame, you see capped worker brood, while at the edges and corners, you see capped honey. But as the baby bees, as the brood begins emerging, honey is coming in, or if there is no honey, you're feeding them syrup, and they'll put it in the spaces where the uh, brood had been, and they'll eventually fill this comb up. And ideally, you need at least one deep box full of honey, if not more, in the northern regions of the United States. So if there's not enough nectar coming in, your bees can really be in trouble, and they can even starve. And this is especially true for package bees put on foundation, because they need to draw out that wax. The queen needs to lay eggs. They need to raise lots of new baby bees and brood, and then they need to also store enough honey to survive the winter. So at first, I recommend feeding all the sugar syrup that they will take. Later on, if the colony is more established and there seems to be a lot of honey and pollen coming in, and they've expanded into 2 deep boxes, you can consider stopping and then maybe restarting feeding later on in the summer or late fall if there's still not quite enough to winter over. And if you think that your colony is not going to have enough syrup, the best thing to do is begin feeding up as soon as you realize that. I know many new beekeepers, they're not sure what to do, and they realize in October that the colony is running short of honey, and so they decide to start feeding. But by then it's too late. The nights are too cold. The bees may not be able to store the syrup as well or ripen it, and you might have open comb with unripened syrup in the comb, and that can cause humidity problems. So if I'm thinking my colony won't have enough for the winter, I'll start feeding up even in August. Use those warm days and warm nights and high bee population to your advantage, so they can store up that syrup as a replacement if they do not have enough honey for winter. So what ratio of sugar syrup should you do? So many of the bee books, and even myself, we would use a more dilute syrup in the spring to stimulate brood production and wax secretion, uh, say a 1-to-1 solution, while later in the summer we would use a more concentrated syrup because it was easier for the bees to uh, take up, and it would require less work in regards to evaporating the water out of that syrup. But as it turns out, it probably doesn't really matter. Here's a, a study from Randy Oliver showing that how fast the foundation was drawn out. Basically, it didn't matter how much or what the concentration is of that syrup that you fed to them. They do it fine. And so myself, I have a lot of hives, and so I don't want to be hauling water weight, any more than I have to. So I tend to feed concentrated syrup both in the spring as well as in the fall, because it's all about the calories in the syrup. And if you're feeding them a more dilute syrup, you're just giving them a lot of water that they're going to have to evaporate off anyway. So the recommendation is thinner syrup in the spring and then a heavier syrup in the fall. You can do that if you want, but honestly, if you want to feed heavy syrup whenever they need feeding, whether it's the spring or in the fall, go for it. Another potential problem is there's not enough pollen coming in. Pollen is protein. It stimulates the nurse bees to produce royal jelly for raising more larvae. And if there's not enough protein coming in, not enough natural pollen, you may need to feed them a protein supplement. And this can be a patty that you put on the hive, or sometimes some of us open feed a dry pollen. We make a pollen feeder that the bees can use at least early in the spring before flowers begin blooming. So how do you determine if the bees need protein supplement? Well, first, if you don't see stored pollen, this is a wonderful frame of stored pollen, otherwise known as bee bread. But if you don't see much being stored, that might be an indication you need to feed them some protein supplement. The other thing you can look at, and this is from Randy Oliver's website, Scientific Beekeeping, is to look if there's a lot of royal jelly with the larva. It's nice to see wet brood like this, or milky brood. Each of these baby larvae are floating in a nice, deep, thick pool of royal jelly. That means the nurse bees have plenty of nutrition, there's plenty of pollen coming in, or if not, they have plenty of protein from a protein supplement. If you see brood like this, these baby larvae are basically starving. They're just a tiny bit of wetness in the bottom of the cell, and so these larvae are not getting as well fed as the previous photo. And this is where you might want to give your colony a protein supplement. But you don't want to feed protein supplement if they don't need it. If there's plenty of pollen coming in, giving them extra supplement is just simply a waste of money. And the other thing is it can encourage the colony to build up faster than you want. I'm a queen bee breeder, and so I do want my colonies to build up in the spring, so I will have enough bees to make splits, to make up mating nukes and cell builders. But if you do that without any plan for making splits, you're simply going to encourage your colony to swarm. And I have known many new beekeepers that heard putting a protein patty was a good thing, so they did it, but they had no plans of doing anything such as making splits. And all they ended up doing is encourage their colonies to swarm, which ended up causing them to not make as much honey later on in the summer. So don't feed protein supplement unless they need it. Well, another problem is there could be robbing. So if there's established colonies nearby and your new colonies are weaker, the stronger colonies may go in and try to steal the honey or syrup that you're feeding from your weaker colony. And it can be devastating. There can be a lot of dead bees as they fight it out, and sometimes even the queen is lost or killed as this is happening. So you can put an entrance reducer in, which can work very well, but even that is sometimes not enough. If necessary, you might need to put in an anti-robbing screen for a particularly weak colony, or at least put a mesh so that the entrance to the colony is in a different direction. The bees that are from that colony, they learn that they need to enter through the edge or the side or the top, whereas the robbers, they try to go straight to the entrance where the screen is, and they never figure out how to get in there. But it's always easier to prevent robbing than it is to stop it after it gets started. It tends to be more common later in the summer or during a drought and less common in the early spring. But if you've introduced new bees into their new hive, and let's say it's a dry spring or dry early summer, you could run into this problem. So always be aware of it. So that brings us to the conclusion of caring for your new colony from spring through summer. I will have more presentations regarding what to do in the late summer and fall to prepare them to survive their first winter. So again, keep in mind as you go through your first spring and summer with your bees that these goals, make sure the hive has everything the bees need to succeed, not just food and water, but also enough space to raise brood and store honey, and that they begin drawing out good quality comb. Make sure your bees are well fed throughout the season so that the hive population can grow and expand, and also make sure that they can have enough space to store honey, or if not, enough sugar syrup to last them through the winter. And again, I will go over winter preparations in much greater detail in another presentation. You need to make sure your queen is healthy and laying lots of eggs, or if not, do something about it. I do have a separate queen presentation that I will go over this in more detail. And then make sure that your bees are healthy without diseases or parasites such as mites. I know a lot of new beekeepers are excited to get bees and they want to get their first honey, but producing extra honey in your first year should not be a primary goal of your first season. Can it happen? Sure, especially if you're starting out with a nucleus colony. If you have a good honey flow and everything is right, there is a chance you might be able to harvest honey in your first year, but don't count on it. Your main goal is so that your bees succeed and survive through their first winter. Just keep in mind that we always need to be thinking ahead, 3 to 6 months ahead of the future. So in April and May, I'm already thinking about where my bees are going to be in July and August. And in July and August, I'm trying to think about where my bees are going to be and what they're going to be like in December, January, and February. You don't want to wait until it comes up that you have to do something and then try to figure it out after the fact. It's always better to be thinking a few months ahead in the future of where you want your bees to be and what you need to do today to get them there. Well, thank you again for watching our series of presentations, Introduction to Beekeeping. I truly hope that you find these presentations helpful in your journey to become a beekeeper. Thank you.